I am Dr. K. Srinivasulu, working as an Associate Professor of Environmental Studies in the Department of BSNH in Nasravapeta Engineering College. Now I am going to explain biodiversity and its conservation. Biodiversity definition. The number of variety of plants, animals and other organisms that exist is an ecosystem is known as biodiversity. It is a measure of variety of organisms present in different ecosystems. The richness of biodiversity depends on the climate, conditions and area of the region. Biodiversity is the result of 3.5 billion of years of evolution. See, we are discussing types of biodiversity. There are three types of biodiversity: genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity, genetic variability or diversity within a species. Species diversity, diversity between different species. Ecosystem diversity, diversity between different regions. Genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the amount of variation in genetic material, DNA. That means deoxyribonucleic acid. Within a species or within a population, the magnitude of variation in genes of species increases with an increase in size and variation parental of the habitat. Genetic diversity has the following importance. It helps in specifications of evolution of new species. It is useful in adaptation of changes environmental conditions. It is important for agriculture productivity and development. Species diversity indicates describe the variety in the number and abundance of the species within a region. The accurately determined species diversity, both the species richness, which is the number of different species, and the relative abundance, which is the number of individuals with each species must be considered. The species richness depends largely on climatic conditions. When a species is confined entirely particularly area, it is termed as endemic species. Here two types of species is there: vulnerable species, endemic species. Ecosystem diversity. It describes the association of interaction of species living together and the physical environment of a given area. It relates varieties of habitats, biotic communities, ecological process in biosphere. It also tells about the diversity within the ecosystem. For example, the landscapes like grasslands, deserts, mountains, forest ecosystem, desert ecosystem, aquatic ecosystem, lake ecosystem, like that. Show ecosystem diversity. In the ecosystem diversity is due to diversity of niches, trophic structures, levels of ecological process like nutrient cycling, food webs, food chains, energy flows. These all are we are discussing in the ecosystem diversity. Such type of diversity can generate more trophic levels and ecological process like nutrient cycling, food webs, energy flow, role of dominant species and various related biotic interactions. Such type of diversity can generate more productive and stable ecosystems are communicate capable of tolerating various types of stresses, example droughts, floods, heavy rains, tornadoes, like that. Biodiversity distribution. Biodiversity is not evenly distributed, rather it varies greatly across the globe as well as within regions. Among other factors, the diversity of all living things, biota, depend on temperature, precipitation, altitude, soils, geography and the presence of other species. Diversity constituently measures higher in the tropics and lower in polar regions generally. Rainforests that have had wet climates for a long time have particularly high biodiversity. This is called rich biodiversity. Terrestrially, biodiversity is thought to be up to 25 times greater than ocean biodiversity. Biodiversity hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is region with a high level of endemic species that has experienced great habitat loss. While hotspots are spread all over the world, the majority are forest areas and most of located in the tropic regions. Colombia is characterized by high biodiversity with the highest rate of species by area until worldwide. It has the largest number of endemics. Here three types of species is there: endemic species, vulnerable species, endangered species. Species that are not found naturally anywhere else of any country. About 10% of the species of the earth can be found in Colombia. Hotspots. At present we are having 34 biodiversity hotspots have been identified. The ones covered 15.7% of the S land surface. 86% of the hotspots habitat has already been destroyed. The intact remnants of the hotspots of cover only 2.3% of the Earth's land surface. Loss of biodiversity. The main cause of the loss of biodiversity can be attributed to the influence of human beings on the world's ecosystem. Escalating human population is a major cause of biodiversity loss. Most of the biodiversity loss has happened post-industrial revolution through the human activities. Species loss rate. The planet has lost 52% of the biodiversity since 1970 according to 2014 study by the World Wide Fund. The Living Planet Report 2014 claims that the number of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, crustaceans, molluscans, arthropods, chordates across the globe in an average about half of the size of was 40 years ago. Of that number, 39 accounts for the terrestrial wildlife gone, 39% of the marine wildlife, that means aquatic species are going to declining, and 76% for the freshwater wildlife gone. Biodiversity took the biggest hit in Latin America. Causes of biodiversity loss. Alteration and loss of the habitat, the transformation of the natural areas determines not only the loss of vegetable species but also decrease in the animal species associated with them. Introduction of exotic species and genetically modified organisms, species organizing from a particular area introduced in now natural environment can lead to different forms of imbalance. In the ecological equilibrium refer to introduction of the exotic species and genetic species modified organisms exactly. Pollution, human activity influences the natural environment producing negative direct or indirect affects alter the flow of energy, the chemical and physical constitution of the environment and abundance of the species. Causes of biodiversity loss, climate change. Now we discuss climate change is one of the most cause because it is released in enormous amount of the pollution released in the climate, so that it will be affect enormous changes in environment we can find out. For example, heating of the earth's surface affects biodiversity because it endangers all the species that adapted to the cold due to the latitude, the polar species or the altitude mountain species. We can observe such type of climatical changes in mountain species. And over exploitation of resources. Indiscriminately we can utilize the resources, it will be affect the climatic change. Not only it will declining in environment, that is the number of species declining in environment. When the activities connected with the capturing and harvesting, hunting, fishing, farming. A renewable natural resources in a particular area is exactly intense. The resource itself may become exhausted. As for example, as the case of sardines, herrings, cod, tuna, and many other species that man captured without leaving enough time for the organisms to reproduce. Loss of biodiversity, habitat loss and degradation. Habitat loss and degradation create the biggest single source of pressure on biodiversity worldwide. For terrestrial ecosystem, habitat loss is largely accounted for by conservation of wild agriculture, which now accounts for some 30% of land globally. In some areas, it has recently been particularly driven by the demand for biofuels, climate change. Climate change is already having an impact on biodiversity and is projected to become a progressively more significant threat in the coming decades. Loss of Arctic sea ice threatens biodiversity across an entire biome and beyond. The related pressure of ocean acidification resulting from higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is also already being observed. Importance of biodiversity. At least 40% of the world's economy of 80% of needs of the poor and derived from biological resources. In addition, the richer of the diversity of life, the greater the opportunity of medical discoveries, economics development, and adaptive resources to such new challenges as climate change. Biogeographic zones. Now we are having 10 biogeographic zones in biodiversity. Trans-Himalayans, Himalayans, desert, semi-arid, Western Ghats, Deccan Peninsula, Gangetic Plain, coast, north, east, islands. Biosphere reserves. Zones in a biosphere reserves, zones of biosphere reserves. Difference between biosphere, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. Biosphere reserves are the biggest entity among the three. The levels of restrictions in the increasing order is biosphere reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, and national parks. The Indian government has established 18 biosphere reserves, over 441 wildlife sanctuaries, and 102 national parks. Importance of biosphere. Biosphere reserves conserve genetic resource, species, ecosystems, and landscapes. Development, restoration, education, and research. India Biosphere Reserves. The Indian government has established 18 biosphere reserves in India. They protect larger areas of natural habitat than a national park of animal sanctuary and often include one or more national parks along with buffer zones that are open to save economic issues. Protection is granted not only to the flora and fauna of the protected region but also to the human communities who habitate these regions and their ways of life. Biopiracy, the practice of commercially exploiting naturally occurring biochemical or genetic material, especially by obtaining patents. The restrict its future use while failing to pay fair compensation to the community from which it originates. Bioprospecting, the search for biological resources and accompanying endogenous knowledge for the purpose of commercial exploitation, a process of appropriation and commercialization of natural products ranging from plants and animals. Bioprospecting is legal but may promote biopiracy. Biopiracy operates through unfair application of patents to genetic resources and traditional knowledge. Biosphere piracy is the theft of usurpation of genetic materials, especially plants and other biological materials by the patent processes. Example, use of indigenous knowledge of medical plants planting by medical companies without recognizing the fact that the knowledge is not new or invented by the planter. BIOPIRAcy deprives the indigenous community to the rights to commercial explanation of the technology that they themselves had developed. Columbian exchange. The Columbian exchange was the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human population, technology and ideas between the Americas, New World and the world in the 15th to 16th centuries related to European colonization and trade after Christopher Columbus 1492 voyage. The contact between the two areas circulated a wide variety of new crops and livestock which supported increases in population in both hemispheres. Although discuss initially caused precipitations in the numbers of indigenous peoples of the America. Traders returned to Europe with maize, potatoes and tomatoes which become very important crops in Europe by the 18th century. The term was first used in 1972 by American historian Alfred W. Crosby in the conversation history book The Columbian Exchange. Biodiversity conservation. Biodiversity conservation. Biodiversity conservation is about saving life on earth, all the forms and keeping natural ecosystems functioning and healthy. Conservation of the two kinds, in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. So, in situ conservation, the conservation of species in their natural habitats is considered the most appropriate way of conserving biodiversity. Conserving the areas where population of species exist naturally is an underlying condition for the conservation of biodiversity. That's why protected areas form a central element of any national strategy to conserve biodiversity. A protected area of geographically defined area that is designated or regulated of managed to achieve specific conservation objects. It may be set aside for the protection of biological diversity and natural and associated culture resources and is managed through legal or the effective means. They include national parks in the natural reserves, sustainable use reserves, biosphere, wilderness area and heritage sites. Ex situ conservations. Ex situ conservation is the preservation of components of biological diversity outside their natural habitats. This involves conservation of genetic resources as well as wildland. Thank you, one and all.